The smell never leaves you. That's what nobody tells you when they first issue you a power sword. When they place that blessed weapon in your hands and explain the activation rituals, the maintenance protocols, the sacred responsibility of bearing a blade touched by the Omnissiah's power. They tell you about honor and duty and the privilege of wielding technology few mortals ever handle. They demonstrate the proper grip, the activation sequence, the way the disruption field shimmers into existence around the blade when you thumb the power stud. They show you how it cuts through ceramite and plasteel like they're parchment, how the molecular disruption field doesn't just sever matter, but unmakes it at the atomic level, leaving edges so clean they seem like violations of physics. But they don't tell you about the smell. The ozone sharp enough to make your eyes water, metallic and acrid like lightning striking too close. The burning flesh that follows the blade's passage. Organic matter flash heated to the point where proteins denature and fat liquefies and skin crisps into carbon. The particular reek when the field disrupts ceramite armor and the heat propagates through to the body beneath, cooking someone alive inside their protective shell before they even realize they've been hit. The way these smells combine and concentrate and follow you everywhere, clinging to your uniform and your hair and the inside of your nostrils until you taste them with every breath, until they become the fundamental odor of your existence. I've been carrying this sword for 11 years. It doesn't have a name, not officially, though I sometimes think of it as witness because it's observed more death than I have memories, has been present for more killing than I can consciously recall, watches silently from my hip through battles that blur together into a continuous stream of violence, punctuated by brief moments of something resembling peace. The tech priests blessed it when they issued it to me, anointed the blade with sacred oils, and inscribed prayers along its fuller in microtext, too small for unaugmented eyes to read. They told me I was receiving a weapon that had served the Emperor for 3 centuries, that had been carried by officers whose names appeared in the regiment's most honored battle rolls, that would serve me faithfully if I maintained it properly and respected its machine spirit. They were right about the service. The sword has never failed me in combat, never refused activation when I needed it, never faltered in its purpose. But they didn't mention the price of that service, didn't explain what it costs to carry a weapon so efficient at killing, so effective at reducing human beings to components and meat. Didn't warn me that every time I drew the blade and activated its field, I'd be adding another layer to the olfactory memory that has become my constant companion, another death to the catalogue of smells that defines my existence more completely than any visual memory or tactical lesson. The first time I killed with it, I was a newly commissioned lieutenant assigned to the 419th Cadian, leading a platoon during a compliance action on some agri-world whose name I've forgotten. We'd been deploying to suppress a labor revolt, nothing complicated, just standard garrison duty, putting down unrest before it could spread to other facilities. The orders were clear: minimal collateral damage to infrastructure, maximum display of imperial authority, use of force authorized but restraint preferred when possible, professional work for professional soldiers. The crowd had gathered outside the primary processing facility, maybe 3,000 workers, armed with agricultural implements and industrial tools, shouting grievances about working conditions and mandatory tithes and the usual complaints that people develop when they forget that their lives belong to the Emperor rather than themselves. We'd formed a cordon, lasguns ready but not aimed, presence alone usually sufficient to disperse gatherings once people recognized we were serious. But this crowd had worked itself into the sort of religious fervor that sometimes emerges in populations that have spent too long without proper imperial oversight, had convinced themselves that the God Emperor would protect them against his own armies, had forgotten that divine favor and military superiority are not mutually exclusive concepts. They charged, not tactically, not with any real coordination, just a surge of bodies driven by emotion and desperation, and the false courage that comes from being part of a mob. Standard procedure would be volley fire, controlled bursts that would drop the front ranks and convince the rest that continued advance meant certain death. But my commissar, a man named Valdus who'd served 30 years, and had seen enough conflicts that he could predict their trajectories, stepped forward and spoke to me directly. "Lieutenant, draw your sword. Let them see it active. Let them understand that we're not just soldiers with guns but officers bearing the Emperor's blessed technology. Sometimes the threat of personal combat focuses minds better than massed firepower." I drew the blade, thumbed the activation stud, felt the power cell engage, and the disruption field shimmer into existence around the edge, turning the metal into something more than just steel, transforming it into a tool that could unmake matter through principles I'd never fully understood. The field glowed with a faint blue luminescence, cast strange shadows, hummed at a frequency I felt in my teeth, and the crowd hesitated, saw me standing there with a weapon that represented everything they weren't: imperial authority, technological superiority, the will to use violence in service of order, and some portion of them began to reconsider their choices. But not all of them. One man, bigger than the others, carrying a power maul he'd probably stolen from an overseer, broke from the crowd and charged directly at me. Maybe he thought killing an officer would inspire his fellows. Maybe he'd simply worked himself into a state where death seemed preferable to continued submission. Maybe he was just too committed to stop, too invested in the rebellion to back down even when survival demanded retreat. His reasons didn't matter. What mattered was that he came at me swinging that maul, came at me with intent to kill, came at me in ways that required response. I met his charge. Not bravely, I was terrified. Had never faced personal combat before. Had spent my entire training focused on squad-level tactics rather than individual dueling. But training overcame terror. Muscle memory executed movements I'd practiced thousands of times in simulations. I sidestepped his swing, brought my blade around in a horizontal cut that military doctrine designated as attack pattern tertius, felt the power sword meet his body at the junction between neck and shoulder. There was no resistance. That's what I remember most clearly. What still disturbs me 11 years later: the blade should have required force, should have met bone and muscle that resisted its passage, should have felt like cutting through something substantial. But the disruption field simply unmade whatever it touched, and my sword passed through his body like it was passing through empty air. Like he wasn't there at all, like the universe had decided his physical existence was optional and chosen to exercise that option. He came apart. Not in the way bodies separate during conventional combat, the messy tearing and breaking that happens with normal weapons. He came apart cleanly, precisely, the two halves of him falling in different directions because the molecular bonds holding him together had simply ceased to exist along the line where my blade had passed. And in the instant before he fell, before gravity claimed the pieces, I saw inside him, saw organs and bone and the structural components that normally stay hidden beneath skin, saw things that human beings aren't meant to observe, the interior architecture that functions only in darkness, that fails when exposed to light and air and observation. Then the smell hit me. Ozone first, sharp and clean, the scent of the disruption field doing its work, of electrical discharge and molecular separation. Then burning flesh, not gradual cooking but instant charring, the edges of the wound flash heated to temperatures that turned tissue black and crispy, that cauterized blood vessels before they could bleed, that sealed the damage in ways that made the injury look almost surgical, except for the particular reek of organic matter reduced to carbon. The smells hit me simultaneously, merged into a single sensory assault that made me gag, that made my eyes water, that made me want to drop the sword and run and never stop running. But I didn't drop it, couldn't drop it, because the crowd was watching, because my platoon was watching, because dropping your weapon in combat is death or worse. So I stood there with my power sword active and humming, stood there with that smell filling my nostrils, stood there while the two halves of that man fell, and the crowd behind him finally understood what imperial authority actually meant when expressed through blessed technology and an officer's willingness to use it. They dispersed. The rebellion ended right there. 3,000 workers suddenly remembering they had families and responsibilities and reasons to live that outweighed whatever grievances had seemed so important minutes earlier. We completed our deployment without firing a shot, achieved the mission objectives through the simple demonstration that we possessed both superior technology and the will to employ it without hesitation. Commissar Valdus commended me for decisive action. My company commander noted the incident favorably in my service record. The tech priests blessed my blade again during the next maintenance cycle, pleased that it had served its purpose so effectively. Nobody mentioned the smell. Nobody acknowledged that I'd spent the next 6 hours breathing it, that it had soaked into my uniform and my hair and my skin, that I'd scrubbed myself raw trying to remove it and still felt like I was drowning in the reek of ozone and burning flesh. Nobody explained that this was normal, that everyone who carries a power sword experiences this, that the smell becomes as much a part of you as the weapon itself. I killed 17 people with that blade during my first year of service. Not a large number compared to what heavy weapons or artillery achieve, not even remarkable compared to what a skilled sniper might accomplish. But each death added to the catalogue of smells I was accumulating. Each activation of the disruption field contributed another layer to the olfactory memory that was becoming my constant companion, and each death was intimate in ways that massed firepower never achieved, required me to be close enough to see faces and hear voices, and smell the fear sweat that people produce when they realize they're about to die. The second death I remember clearly was an orc. We'd been deployed to a frontier world, supporting guard elements in clearing greenskin infestations from mining colonies, and I'd led my platoon in an assault on an orc position that had been harassing supply convoys. Standard operation preliminary bombardment, infantry advance under covering fire, close combat to secure the position once the orcs decided to fight rather than flee. I'd drawn my sword during the final assault because power weapons are effective against orc physiology in ways that lasguns sometimes aren't, because disruption fields cut through their thick hides and dense musculature without the shot placement precision that conventional firearms require. I'd killed 3 orcs with lasgun fire before one got close enough that switching to the blade made tactical sense. It was massive, even by orc standards, probably close to 3 meters tall, and massed like something that shouldn't be able to move with the speed it demonstrated. It swung a cleaver the size of my torso, crude but effective, capable of bisecting someone even through carapace armor if the blow landed properly. I activated my sword and met its charge, using footwork rather than strength, letting its momentum carry it past me while I struck at its midsection. The blade cut through its armor, scrap, metal, and leather, and things I couldn't identify like it wasn't there. Cut through muscle and bone and organs with the same lack of resistance I'd experienced with the human rebel. But orcs are different from humans in ways that matter. They don't die clean, don't die quietly, even cut nearly in half. Even with organs exposed and systems failing, this one kept fighting, kept swinging its cleaver, kept trying to kill me with the sort of determination that makes orcs the threat they are despite their apparent primitiveness. I had to strike twice more before it finally stopped moving. Had to hack through its body with repeated cuts because its alien physiology refused to acknowledge that it should be dead. The smell was different. Still ozone, still burning flesh, but wrong somehow. Orc biology produces odors that human systems don't, secretes compounds that make the burning flesh smell not just charred, but rotten, like meat that's been left too long in sunlight, like gangrene and decay, despite the flash heating that should prevent bacterial action. And orc blood, when superheated by a disruption field, releases chemical volatiles that make your eyes burn and your throat close, that trigger nausea so intense I vomited inside my rebreather and had to continue fighting while breathing my own bile. I killed 6 more orcs that day. Each one added its particular variation to the smell catalogue I was building. Each one taught me that death has signatures, that different species and different causes produce different scent profiles, that a power sword wielded against various enemies creates a taxonomy of death, rendered in olfactory terms that normal people never experience and couldn't understand even if you tried to explain them. The smell started appearing in my dreams after that campaign. Not visual dreams where I saw the people and xenos I'd killed, but purely olfactory experiences where I'd be drowning in the reek of ozone and burning flesh, unable to escape, unable to breathe anything except the smell of death mediated through molecular disruption fields. I'd wake up gasping, convinced the smell was real, only to discover my quarters smelled normal recycled air and machine oil and the 100 other odors that characterize guard facilities. But the dream smell would linger for minutes or hours, would overlay whatever I actually smelled, until I couldn't distinguish between memory and perception, until past deaths contaminated present experience. The company Medicae said it was normal, said that humans are neurologically wired to remember smells more vividly than other sensory data, that olfactory memories connect directly to emotional processing centers in ways that visual or auditory memories don't, that experiencing intense events, accompanied by distinctive smells, creates associations that can't be easily deleted. He prescribed some mild sedatives, suggested I avoid strong odors when possible, told me the dreams would fade with time as my brain processed the trauma. He was wrong. Or right about the neurology, but wrong about the dreams fading. They didn't fade. They intensified. Each deployment, each combat action, each activation of my power sword added to the dream catalogue, contributed new variations to the olfactory experiences that haunted my sleep, and the smells began blending together, mixing into combinations that had never existed in reality, creating synthetic stenches that were somehow worse than the actual smells, because they represented accumulated death rather than individual killings. By my 3rd year of service, I'd killed over 100 people with the blade, enemies of the Imperium, all of them heretics, rebels, xenos, traitors, each death justified by orders and necessity, and the fundamental logic of warfare that says killing enemies is not murder but duty. Each death adding its signature to the catalogue I carried, contributing its particular scent profile to the collection that defined my existence more completely than any other aspect of my identity. I started noticing the smell even when the sword wasn't active, would be sitting in my quarters during downtime, the blade secured in its scabbard, power cell disconnected, completely inert. But I'd smell ozone, would smell burning flesh, would experience the full sensory assault of a power sword's activation despite no activation having occurred. At first I thought it was psychosomatic, my brain producing phantom smells based on memory and association, but the intensity suggested otherwise, suggested that something about the weapon itself had absorbed the scent, had become saturated with the olfactory signatures of everyone it had killed, had transformed into an object that constantly radiated the smell of death even when dormant. I took it to the tech priests for evaluation, explained that I was experiencing persistent odors that seemed to emanate from the weapon itself, that the smell remained even after thorough cleaning and proper maintenance, that something about the blade had changed in ways I couldn't articulate. The tech priests performed their diagnostics, tested the power cell, examined the disruption field generator, analyzed the blade's molecular structure. Everything registered as optimal. The weapon functioned perfectly, showed no degradation, maintained all specifications according to the blessed schematics that governed its design. The machine spirit is content, the lead tech priest informed me. You have honored it through proper use and maintenance. The weapon serves you faithfully. There is no malfunction to address, but the smell, olfactory phenomena are biological concerns, not mechanical ones. The weapon produces no odors in its inactive state. What you perceive originates from your own neural processing, not from the blade itself. Accept this as a consequence of service and continue your duties. He was wrong. Or right about the mechanics, but wrong about the source. Because the smell wasn't just in my head. Other people noticed it too. Fellow officers would comment on the strange odor when I entered rooms, would ask if something was burning, or if there'd been electrical malfunction nearby. Troopers would wrinkle their noses when I passed, would exchange glances that suggested they perceived something wrong even if they couldn't articulate what. My quarters acquired a reputation no one wanted to visit. No one wanted to spend time in spaces that smelled like constant low-grade electrical discharge overlaid with the ghost of burned meat. I requested transfer to a position that wouldn't require carrying a power sword. Not from cowardice or dereliction, but from the desperate hope that distance from the weapon might break whatever connection had formed, might allow me to escape the smell that had become my constant companion. The request was denied. Officers of my rank and experience were expected to bear power weapons, were required to demonstrate their status through visible symbols of authority, couldn't be reassigned to positions that would represent demotion or diminishment. The sword was mine. I was its bearer. The relationship was permanent, would continue until death or grievous injury, or promotion to ranks that carried different weapons. So I adapted, learned to function while drowning in smells that nobody else seemed to perceive with the same intensity, learned to conduct normal duties while experiencing olfactory assault that made every breath taste like death, learned to kill with the blade while adding each new death to the catalogue I carried, while knowing that every activation made the smell stronger, made the weapon more saturated with the olfactory signatures of its victims, made escape more impossible. The worst kill happened during my 6th year. We'd been deployed to suppress a cult uprising on a hive world, and I'd led my company in storming the cult's primary sanctuary, a converted manufactorum they'd transformed into a blasphemous temple, dedicated to powers I won't name because naming them grants them power. We'd breached the outer defenses, fought through corridors filled with cultists, whose mutations revealed how thoroughly they'd surrendered their humanity, secured room after room until we reached the central chamber where their leadership conducted whatever rituals their corrupted faith required. I found their leader kneeling before an altar, her back to me, completely focused on whatever prayer or summoning she was performing. Standard procedure would be execution at range, a lasgun shot to the head or spine, quick and efficient and safe. But something about the scene demanded closer engagement, demanded that I use the sword, demanded that I make this death personal in ways that massed firepower couldn't achieve. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was rage at what these cultists had done to the hive's population. Maybe it was something darker that I didn't want to examine too closely. I approached her, drew my sword, activated the disruption field. She turned as I struck, turned just enough that instead of taking her head cleanly, I caught her face, the blade entering through her left cheek and exiting through her right temple. And in that instant, before she died, before the massive trauma scrambled her brain and ended consciousness, our eyes met. She looked at me with an expression I still can't adequately describe, not fear or anger or pain, but something closer to pity, as if she understood something about me that I didn't understand about myself, as if she saw what I'd become through carrying this weapon and felt sorry for me, rather than angry about her impending death. Then the smell hit. But wrong. All wrong. Her flesh burned like everything else, produced the expected charring and the familiar ozone from the disruption field's activation. But underneath those expected odors was something else, something that shouldn't exist, something that smelled like corruption given scent, like rot that was somehow alive, like decay that possessed intelligence and purpose. The smell bypassed my nose entirely, seemed to insert itself directly into my brain, made me aware of it not through normal olfactory processing but through some other sense I didn't know I possessed. I vomited, dropped to my knees and evacuated my stomach contents, while my sword remained buried in her skull, while her body stayed upright, supported by the blade, while that impossible smell saturated everything. My troops secured the chamber around me, completed the operation while I knelt in my own bile, unable to function, unable to process what I'd experienced, unable to explain why killing this particular heretic had affected me so differently than the hundreds of previous deaths. The smell from that kill never left. The others would fade eventually, would recede from immediate perception until reactivated by dreams or triggers or new deaths that reminded me of old ones. But her smell stayed constant, stayed immediate, a permanent addition to my sensory experience that I couldn't escape or diminish. Every breath carried traces of it. Every moment of every day included awareness of that corrupted stench underlying everything else. It became the foundation of my olfactory experience, the base note that all other smells layered upon, the fundamental reek that defined my existence. The tech priests couldn't explain it. The Medicae couldn't treat it. The commissariat suggested I was suffering from corruption exposure, that killing a cult leader had somehow tainted me, that I should be monitored for signs of spiritual contamination. But their tests showed nothing abnormal. My faith remained solid. My loyalty was unquestioned. My service record demonstrated continued effectiveness. Whatever had happened to me didn't manifest in any way they could measure or assess. I started understanding what the weapon really was during my 8th year of carrying it. Not just a tool that disrupted molecular bonds, not just blessed technology that made killing efficient. It was a repository, a catalogue, a living record of every death it had caused across 3 centuries of service. And I wasn't just its bearer, I was its witness, its scribe, its memory. The sword used me to record its kills, encoded each death into my neural architecture through scent, because smell is how humans store their deepest memories, how we connect emotional significance to experience, how we remember things that matter more than words can express. Every officer who'd carried this blade before me had served the same function, had accumulated their own catalogues of death rendered in olfactory terms, had drowned in smells that nobody else perceived, that marked them as the sword's chosen witnesses, that transformed them from simple bearers into something more complex and more troubled. And when they'd rotated to other positions or died in service or been promoted beyond the rank that carried power swords, the weapon had been passed to the next bearer, the next witness, the next person who'd learned that carrying blessed technology came with prices the tech priests never mentioned and couldn't acknowledge. I found records of previous bearers during a routine archive review. 17 names spanning 3 centuries, each one serving between 4 and 15 years before moving to other positions. I cross-referenced their subsequent service histories, looking for patterns, looking for some indication that they'd experienced what I was experiencing, and I found them: medical records showing olfactory hallucinations, psychological evaluations noting sensory disturbances, requests for transfer to positions that didn't require power weapons, and in every case, the same outcome: requests denied, service continuing, bearers remaining tethered to their blades, until something retirement, death, promotion finally separated them from weapons that had become extensions of their identity. 3 of the 17 had committed suicide, not during their time as sword-bearers, but years later, after they'd rotated to other positions, after they'd spent enough time away from the blade that you'd think they'd recovered, but the record suggested otherwise. Suggested they'd never escaped the catalogues they'd accumulated, had carried those olfactory memories through the rest of their service until the weight became unbearable, and they chose oblivion over continued existence, drowning in the remembered smell of death. I began documenting my own experiences, created detailed records of every kill, every activation, every addition to the catalogue I was accumulating, wrote descriptions of the smells, because writing them seemed like the only way to externalize them, to place them somewhere outside my own consciousness, to create a record that might help future bearers understand what they were accepting when they received this weapon. I filled data slates with olfactory descriptions, created a taxonomy of death smells that covered hundreds of entries, documented the nuances and variations that different victims produced when their molecular bonds were disrupted and their flesh flash heated to temperatures that turned proteins into carbon. The documentation helped, not because it reduced the smells or made them easier to bear, but because it gave them structure, transformed them from overwhelming sensory assault into something I could analyze and categorize and comprehend, made them feel less like divine punishment and more like data that could be studied, understood, potentially managed through methodical analysis. But reading my own documentation was disturbing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Seeing the entries accumulate, seeing the catalogue grow with each deployment, seeing the evidence of exactly how many deaths I'd caused and how precisely I'd recorded them, it made me confront what I'd become. Not just a soldier following orders, not just an officer serving the Emperor's will, but something closer to a collector, a curator, someone who'd built an identity around death, mediated through a specific weapon, someone who'd transformed killing into a systematic practice, worthy of detailed documentation. I killed my 300th victim during my 10th year. A heretic like so many others, someone who'd chosen rebellion over loyalty, someone whose death served the Imperium's interests and advanced the cause of order against chaos. But 300 deaths felt significant in ways that 299 didn't, crossed some threshold that forced me to acknowledge the scale of what I'd done, the number of lives I'd ended, the accumulated weight of all those deaths rendered in olfactory terms that I'd carry forever. The smell after that kill was no different than any other. Ozone and burning flesh, the same signature the disruption field always produced. Nothing special or remarkable about this particular death compared to the hundreds that preceded it, but standing there with my sword active and humming, standing there breathing that familiar reek, standing there knowing this was number 300 in a catalogue that would only continue growing, something broke in me, or hardened, or transformed into something I didn't have adequate language to describe. I realized I couldn't remember what normal smells were anymore. Couldn't recall what food tasted like when it wasn't overlaid with the ghost of ozone and burning flesh. Couldn't experience any odor without it triggering associations with specific kills, specific deaths, specific moments when I'd activated my blade and added another entry to the catalogue. The smell of death had become so fundamental to my sensory experience that everything else had become variation on that theme, modifications of the bass note that defined my existence, and I realized I didn't want to stop. That's what troubled me most. Despite the dreams and the documentation and the growing understanding of what this weapon was doing to me, despite knowing that carrying this blade meant accumulating a burden that had driven previous bearers to suicide, despite all the rational reasons to request transfer or refuse further deployment, I wanted to continue, wanted to activate the disruption field and feel it hum, wanted to add more entries to my catalogue, wanted to serve as the sword's witness for as long as service remained possible. Maybe that was the weapon's real corruption. Not spiritual taint in the way the commissariat feared, not chaos seeping through my defenses, but something more subtle and more complete. The sword had made me into what it needed, a bearer who'd embraced rather than resisted the burden, who'd transformed the horror of accumulated death into something closer to purpose, who'd found identity in the catalogue of smells that would have broken someone less thoroughly adapted to its requirements. I'm writing this during my 11th year of carrying the blade. I've killed 347 people and xenos with it. Each death is recorded in my documentation. Each death is catalogued in my olfactory memory. Each death contributes to the smell that saturates my existence, that makes every breath taste like ozone and burning flesh, that marks me as the sword's witness in ways that nobody who hasn't carried a power sword could understand. The weapon has a new bearer waiting. A young lieutenant, recently commissioned, eager and idealistic, and completely unaware of what accepting this particular honor will cost. The tech priests will bless the blade again before transferring it, will explain the maintenance protocols and sacred responsibilities. They'll tell him about honor and duty and the privilege of bearing blessed technology. They'll demonstrate the proper grip and activation sequence. They'll show him how it cuts through armor like parchment, but they won't tell him about the smell. Won't explain that he's accepting a burden that will transform him, that will saturate his sensory experience with death rendered in olfactory terms, that will make him into the sword's next witness, whether he wants that role or not. Won't warn him that the smell never leaves you, that it becomes as much a part of your identity as your name or rank, that it follows you through deployments and dreams and every moment of continued existence. I could tell him, could pull him aside and explain what he's really accepting, could show him my documentation, could describe the catalogue he'll accumulate, could warn him that 3 previous bearers ended their own lives years after rotating away from this weapon, could give him the choice that I wasn't given, the knowledge that I had to discover through experience and suffering, and the slow realization that carrying blessed technology comes with prices the Imperium doesn't acknowledge. But I won't tell him, because the sword needs bearers, Because the Imperium needs officers willing to carry power weapons. Because warfare requires people who'll accept these burdens so that others don't have to. And because some part of me, the part that's been transformed by 11 years of service, as the sword's witness believes he should experience this himself, should discover through his own deaths, and his own documentation, and his own accumulating catalogue, what it really means to bear a blade that disrupts molecular bonds and flash heats flesh and produces smells that define existence more completely than any visual memory or tactical lesson. The smell never leaves you. It becomes you. You become it. The distinction dissolves after enough deaths, enough activations, enough additions to the catalogue, and eventually you realize you're not carrying the sword anymore. The sword is carrying you, using you as its repository, encoding its history into your neural architecture through scent, because smell is how humans remember things that matter, how we connect significance to experience, how we store truth that words can't express. I activate my blade now, not because combat requires it, not because enemies threaten, but because I need to smell it again, need to experience that familiar combination of ozone and burning flesh, need to remember what I am, what I've become, what service has transformed me into. The disruption field shimmers into existence, the humming fills my ears, and the smell that blessed, terrible, defining smell surrounds me like an embrace, like a prison, like the only truth I have left. 347 deaths, hundreds more to come. The catalogue grows, the documentation expands, the smell intensifies, and I continue serving because service is all I have, because the sword has made me into what it needs, because I've embraced the burden that broke previous bearers and will break future ones. The smell never leaves you. It becomes everything, forever. The power sword hums. I breathe. The ozone and burning flesh fill my lungs, and I am home,